welcome to Mr. McKeown and his team. I just want to first of all come to your opening statement, Mr. McKeown. You talked several times on page 2 and 3 about fraud and error. Now I know some of this was dealt with earlier. Unfortunately, I had a media interview, so I missed some of that. So apologies if I do repeat any of the questions. First of all, I know you're the accounting officer, so you're ultimately responsible, but who in terms of your colleagues here has responsibility for oversight of fraud and error? Who specifically would be dealing with that?
Kathleen Stack.
Kathleen, okay. I might come to you at some point, Kathleen. Thank you. So on page 3, you talk about the overall fraud and error level, the net level being 2%. Is that in 2016?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's an estimate based on fraud and error surveys conducted over the past 5 years.
Oh, it's over a 5-year period. Yeah. Okay. And then you said the range is somewhere between 0.5% and 5%. Isn't that it? That
was for, I believe, I quoted invalidity pension in that case.
Yeah, but it's the range. The average is 2%, but the range is somewhere between 0.5 and 5, and that's over 13 different schemes.
Yeah.
And that the outlier was the pharmacist, which was 10.4, but by and large the rest are somewhere within that range of 0.5 to 5. Can you give us a breakdown then of those 13 schemes and what the percentages are?
Yeah, I believe they're provided in the chapter provided, but just if I talk about the schemes here.
No, I don't need you to talk about the schemes. I'm just
just the breakdown. Yeah, the figures.
Can we get this up on the screen then? That's it there.
No. Yeah, there it is. You've got it there.
That's the. Okay. So then we have the range is somewhere between 0.5% and 5%, but the average is 2%. And while you note that the Controller and Auditor General's office sees the 2% figure as material, in other words, that it's enough to merit attention, I would imagine, Mr. Harkness, that. But you make the point then that in international comparison terms, it isn't out of kilter, if you like. Is that fair analysis?
Yeah.
Okay. So can I have a breakdown then? Because does it give? So the percentages are on the right-hand side, isn't it?
Yeah, the net figure. The net figure there are the percentages.
The net figure is percentages. So, of the net figures in these 13 different areas, what is the breakdown in terms of what is fraud and what is error?
It varies by scheme, but I can tell you that the overall amount is that it's roughly 35% is fraud, about 54% customer error, about 13% what we call estate cases, which are people when they die and then we get a statement from their estate and we find out that actually
I don't want approximate figures, Mr. McKeown, I want accurate figures.
For each scheme?
Yes.
Well, I don't have them all with me, but we can certainly send them to you. They're published on our website. There's no secrecy to them.
I'll tell you why I want them, and I think you should have them, because obviously this is one of the issues that was identified by the Controller and Auditor General. What you have done in your opening statement, Mr. McKeown, and I think this is the problem, and I want to tease this out with you. I'm reading from your opening statement where you talk about overwhelming majority of customers who are open and honest in their dealings with the department, and imposing controls and checks that are intended to reduce fraud and error. When the evidence is that levels of fraud and error are relatively low, we cannot pursue the elimination of error or fraud. In the next paragraph, you talk about fraud and error surveys. Again, you talk about fraud and error into the future. Most schemes surveyed the range of fraud and errors between 0.5% and 5%. Why is fraud and error lumped into one category? Can you explain that to me?
Well, I suppose it's just a measure of the amount of money which is being spent that unnecessarily. That's really they're the component parts of that measure. In commercial industry, people talk about shrinkage rates. It's roughly the same thing. It's what's the overall loss, which is not due, so that's why they're together.
I want you then, Mr. McKeown, wearing your hat as the accounting officer to the Public Accounts Committee, to explain to me, in layman's terms, in your opinion, what the difference between fraud and what the difference between error is, please.
Okay. We covered these earlier on. I can actually call out, one of my colleagues actually had the figures, so if you want, I'll call them out.
And then answer the question of the difference between fraud and error.
Well, maybe I'll answer the question first, then call them out, because...
You can, of course.
Okay. The difference between fraud and error, there's it's specified in Section 302, I think, of the Social Welfare Consolidation Act, where fraud is where customers fail to provide information which results in us paying them too much, and that failure to provide information or the provision of false information was a deliberate, willful and knowing act. And the onus of proof for fraud at point of claim, or to provide the correct information at point of claim, is with the claimant, but on review the onus of proof for us is on the department. So we have to be able to, we're going to categorise something as fraud, we have to in effect be able to say beyond a reasonable doubt that not only did I not get the right information from John McKeown, and I can see that he withheld it from me, but actually I know that he did it willfully, knowingly and deliberately. And that's the distinction. And
it's a very important distinction. So my next question then, because you can hold off on giving me the breakdown, because I'll come to that. I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Stick to this theme of the difference between fraud and error, because I actually think it's very important. You've given the distinction, and I accept it. So our understanding of the difference is a shared one. Is fraud a criminal act, or at least it can be?
It is a criminal act.
Criminal act. It is a criminal act. Is error a criminal act?
No.
Okay. Is there a stigma attached to fraud?
Well, sorry, I presume there is. I mean, it depends on a person's perspective. I mean, in general society, I think there is. I think it's fair to say. It's fair to say that there wouldn't be the same level of stigma attached to error. Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of opinion, but well, it's not a matter of opinion. If there's an error isn't deliberate, intentional, it doesn't have criminal consequences, it's simply an error. Fraud is a deliberate act to defraud the state. So yeah, absolutely, I agree, yes. Okay. And then that puzzles me then, because every single time you mention fraud, you mention error. On every single occasion. And to go back over your opening statement, fraud and error, fraud and error, fraud and error. And what I'm saying is that that's not an appropriate way to deal with both issues. In process terms, you need to separate instances of fraud from instances of error. And the reason is because the perception can be, because the media perception when these figures are covered is that this is all about fraud and isn't necessarily about error. So go back to the figure again. In over a course of 5 years, the net level of fraud and error. And even that, you look at that, the net level of fraud and error is 2%. The assumption could be that, well, it's fraud and the level of fraud is 2%, but it actually isn't the case, because what you said is only 30% is actual fraud. Is that correct? It's about 35, 34. I have the exact number here. Okay, so what I want from you then is the net level of fraud and the net level of error over the 5-year period. Okay, well, I'll call them out to you. Just with regard to the fraud and error, and it is, as I said at the beginning, from a control perspective, when as accounting officer I'm trying to reduce unnecessary spend, the sources of unnecessary spend are departmental error, my staff making mistakes, their customer error, the customer mistakenly giving us the wrong information, and there's fraud. So there are three components of one thing. And the studies we do, and just to be fair, the Controller and Auditor General reports on them as fraud and error, so I've got to account on them as fraud and error. And I'm posing the questions, okay? So the Controller and Auditor General can have whatever processes they like. I'm posing the questions, and what I'm putting to you, sorry, Caherla, what I'm putting to you is that lumping in fraud and error as one, even in terms of controls, in my view, is not the appropriate way to deal with it. Yeah, you can still deal with them separately, so you can give us separate figures on fraud and separate figures on error and separate figures on overpayments, and then we can see what the scale of the problem is. So all I want of you at this point in time, if I can, Mr. McKeown, is from your opening statement, you say that the net level of fraud and error over 13 schemes and the overall net figure is an average of 2%. Okay. So what I'm looking from you is the net level figure over the 5-year period for fraud and the net level figure for error. Maybe Ms. Stack might have. Oh, well, I can call the figures out to you. If I take invalidity pension, the overall level is 0.4%. Sorry, overall? Okay, yeah, fraud and error, the net cost. So what's the difference, the distinction between fraud and error then? Sorry, 0.5. Sorry, invalidity. Sorry, 0.5%. Sorry, the fraud is 0.1. The error is 0.4. So just stop for 1 second. Yeah. So in that one, the very first one we've touched on, error makes up 80% of it. Oh, yes.
And fraud is only 20%.
Yeah.
Which is a good enough reason why they should be clearly separated out.
And they are, sorry, just to be absolutely clear.
No, but they're not in the presentation of how they're given to us, because you didn't separate them out.
Well, no, I think there's a difference between the opening statement and the report in the Control and Auditor General's report, the chapter in the...
I don't see them, I see the net figure, I don't see them broken up into fraud and error.
And I think,
your opening statement is important. Sorry, Mr. McKeown, and just bear with me for a second. Your opening statement is important. You have come into the Public Accounts Committee today. You have dealt with what is in the Controller and Auditor General's report, Chapter 16. You have referenced, every time you talked about fraud, you referenced error. You talk about it in terms of fraud and error. So you did not, with respect, come in today and give any distinction between fraud and error. Nowhere in your opening statement have you given that distinction or the breakdown. I have had to tease those figures out. And we now see that the vast majority of the mistakes are error, or the vast majority of the money that should not have been paid was paid in error.
I think to be fair,
the minority is fraud.
I think to be fair, Deputy, I quoted the figures that were in the Controller and Auditor General's report because that's what I'm responding to. I was very careful, and I did this deliberately because it's what I believe. I was very careful to talk about the fact that the overwhelming majority of customers are open and honest in their dealings. I was very clear to say the evidence is the levels of fraud and error are relatively low. I was very careful to say we cannot frustrate access to entitlement. I was very careful to say that regrettably only a very, very small minority of people. I said all of those things. So I think although I didn't put the figures out, I was very clear to draw the distinction. Also, in our fraud and error studies which we publish, the figures are very clearly broken out. And they're on our website, and we are always very careful. The department itself is always very careful when it talks about this issue to draw that precise distinction. I'm asked today to respond to the data in the Controller and Auditor General's report. That's what I did.
I'm not convinced, Mr. McKeown.
Well, I'm sorry. If that's the case, I'm sorry that obviously, I could have put the figures in, but there's certainly no intention on my part to overstate the existence of fraud, and I thought I'd been very clear in trying to make it clear that fraud is overstated generally in the public, and it's not. And if you're here for the earlier discussion, you'd have heard me talk about the level of fraud being sensationalised in a way that it should not be.
Okay, and I'm going to come to that because I do, and I was going to get to the point that in your concluding remarks, you do say that there is a very, very small amount of fraud in the system.
Yeah.
So you do acknowledge that. My point is that in accounting terms, and in the substance of where fraud is dealt with, it's dealt with in the context of error as well, and the figures are the overall, and they're not separated. So what I'm saying is that just be conscious of that.
Oh, I'm very
conscious of that for obvious reasons, and I want to get to the obvious reason because it was already dealt with.
But I am very conscious of it, and I
acknowledge that you are. You have said that. Okay, and I acknowledge that. So what I'm saying is this. And I know it was dealt with already, and I know it's not for you to comment on the actions of a minister or the actions of government, but we did have a very high-profile campaign that did attract a lot of media attention, that did give a suggestion that the levels of fraud in the social welfare, social protection system were potentially much higher than they were. There was a campaign recently, and somebody mentioned the bus campaign and social welfare cheats. I think the word cheat was used. Can you explain to me, first of all, how much that campaign cost? And can you also explain to me whose idea was it?
Okay.
Did that come from a civil servant, or was that more from the political sphere?
Okay, the answer to two questions. The cost, and we've just finalised the cost, we've got all the final invoices in, is actually €163,000.
We had a discussion on this while you were out, but carry on anyway. Yeah.
€163,000, excluding VAT, so the net cost of the Exchequer is €163,000. The intention to have a communication campaign about the issue of providing correct information to deter fraud and to assure customers about that the department taking fraud seriously was actually a departmental view. It was in our fraud and stress. proposal and the intention to have a communication campaign was the department's proposal. It's been in our fraud and error strategy, control strategy for some time now. It's something that all other administrations do. It's something that has been communicated to us before, actually in this forum, that maybe we should do more to communicate about it. So that was on the table. The actual campaign was developed in a tender process by an external company. We have received feedback on messaging. I take that feedback on board. The putting the word cheat beside the word welfare, I think we've learned from that.
When you say you've learned from that, was it a mistake?
In retrospect, I believe it was a mistake. I believe it was, but I think to be fair, at the time, you take the best advice from professional advisors in marketing and advertising and communications companies. You take their advice and you run with it. And I think, based on feedback, I think we would probably reflect on that messaging in the future.
And I want to, at this point, because I know questions here can be robust, I want to commend you for accepting that maybe it was a mistake. I want to commend you from learning from the process, because I think that's important. We don't often get that, or don't get it enough, from accounting officers. So I think that is the right approach, and I commend you for it. So I just want to move on, if I can, very quickly to the issue of job PAT, which I think is under your remit. Again, which of your colleagues would be responsible for that, in case I might have to put questions?
Actually, the colleague responsible for job PAT isn't here today, but I'll take the questions.
Okay, so how much did jobs PAT cost from July 2015 up to September 2017, or over a 2-year period, roughly?
It's over that period, I think it was roughly 70 to 71 million. It's running at between 30 and 35 million a year at the moment. 71
million a year, and you're accountable for
No,
that?
no, not per annum. That was over 2.5 years. Over a 2.5 year period. It's running at about 30 to 35 million per annum at the moment.
And you're accountable for that spend?
Yes, I account for the spend.
And how is that money spent? Who is it given to?
It's paid to contractors who are engaged to provide case officer employment advisory services to job seekers that we refer to them. It's paid on the basis of outcomes.
Tourist Nua and CTEC, isn't it?
Are the two contractors, yes.
Okay. And so can you answer questions then on the detail of that 71.2 million spent, how they spend that money?
Well, to the extent, so it depends on the detail.
Level agreement we take it.
We do, yeah, and it depends on the level of detail. But I mean, to ask,
but the level
away.
of detail is important, because I made this point earlier. There's a lot of outsourcing going on in the public sector, and we're outsourcing service delivery. And the problem then invariably is that when we then ask questions, and it's our job to make sure that all of the money is spent wisely, and in process terms, we need to be able to ensure that we hold accountable officers to account. Yeah. But because there's a service level agreement in place and the money is outsourced, we get very general responses back, but that's for the organisation to account for how the money is spent. In fact, it isn't. It should be for the accounting officer. Okay. So I have questions in relation to the fees that are paid. So my understanding is there's initial registration fee paid. Is that the case? That's right. And how much is that? I don't want to say what the absolute fee is. There's a different fee for different providers. I can tell you that overall it's under 10% of the total payments. Yeah, I've asked you a simple question, and the first response back is, I don't want to say. Why can you not say? Because these services were procured pursuant to a competitive tendering process. They were closed tenders. They were assessed by an independent tender evaluation team. The prices are confidential to the providers as provided for under EU procurement law. Do you want to stop? Sorry, I just want to make one more point about it. I've heard, and I accept what you're saying, and I want to turn to the Coherla, because this is a problem here, Coherla, in my view, where we have 71.2 million over 2 years. It's outsourced to two companies. Correct. The very first question I've asked is, well, it's a simple question really. There's an initial registration fee paid, and we can't even get that initial registration fee because of commercial sensitivity, I would imagine, is the issue. And that's the problem with this outsourcing. How are we meant to understand how this money is spent, or whether or not the initial registration fee is appropriate or inappropriate, or even anything in relation to it, if we can't get those figures? Is it the same registration fee for both organisations? No, they're two different registration fees. And I think this is as much about protecting the state's interest, because we don't want one provider to say, oh, they've charged X amount and we've charged X minus. You know, why don't we try to get our fees increased? We've got to keep that confidential. It's protecting the state's interest. What I would say about this, to be fair, and I know there's, people have different views on job PAT, the actual remuneration model is an outcomes-based model. They only get paid, other than the registration fee, which, as I said, is less than 10% of the overall fee. I'm going to come to that now in terms of performance. But
they're paid based on employment outcomes.
Yeah.
So there is an outcome. They're not paid. A lot of state contracts, including, I have to say, we have contracts with local employment services, with job clubs, with our own branch offices. We pay them based on inputs. You know, this is a contract which is based on outcomes, which by any measure is a better way to manage contracts.
And I just want to put a number of other questions, but my first observation is you make the point that confidentiality here could be seen, or you would see it as a way of protecting the state.
Yes.
Because you want to make sure you get the best possible price. So
yes.
There's a logic to that, but only on the basis that you accept that outsourcing of all of this is good, because confidentiality also means that we don't have accountability, or at least full accountability and transparency. But you're not accountable to me today, because you can't tell me what the registration fee is, which is my point. You're accountable to me, but you can't actually be accountable, because what you're saying is there's a wall that has been put between us, and the wall is confidentiality and commercial sensitivity. And while you could argue at one level, well, this is about protecting the state, this is the Public Accounts Committee, where we are putting questions to you about how money is spent. And I want to get to the next question.
I accept your frustration, Deputy. I absolutely understand it.
Well, I'm not easily frustrated. It's not frustration. It's probing and trying to get answers to questions. But I just want to say
I accept the frustration, but I think what you can ask about, and I think is germane to whether the money has been spent effectively or not, is the overall level that's been spent, the employment outcomes that are being achieved, the quality of service, and does the overall amount, compared to other ways that we spend the money, does it deliver the same or better outcomes? And I think that's a...
Thank you for that advice in terms of what I can ask questions on. But I'm the one asking the questions, and I will determine whether or not the questions are relevant or not relevant. And my next question is that the initial registration fee is one part of the payment.
Yeah.
Another part of the payment is payments are made based on when a client achieves sustained employment. And there could be a number of payments. So what is the range of payments made?
The payments, we make a payment if somebody who is with JobPat secures employment where that employment lasts for at least 13 weeks.
What would the average payment be?
I'll come to that now, where that employment lasts at least 13 weeks and it's of at least 30 hours duration per week, so it's a full-time job. And we pay that over a period of 4 quarters, provided that the person stays in employment for the full duration of those 4 quarters.
So this is where the job seeker has developed a personal progression path.
That's right.
And then so what I'm looking for is an average of, because what you're saying then is payments are made.
There are 3 tiers of payments.
3 tiers of payments. So what is the average payment paid?
So just to explain, there are different payments made depending on the prior duration of unemployment of the individual concerned. So is the person unemployed 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or more than 3 years? So it's quite a complex payment structure. As I said, the total amount that we're paying out is in the order of 30 to 35 million a year. 10% of that is roughly, or 10% of the fees are with registration fees, so the balance predominantly would be in sustainment fees. Again, I don't want to begin, because we have a competitive tendering process, closed procurement. In order to get the best value for the state, if I publish those figures, it kind of takes away our negotiating position.
So can I just, for clarification purposes, Mr. McKeown, are you telling me again that you are not in a position to give us the average, even the average that is paid to a company based on an individual? So we're not looking for an individual breakdown of each person. The average in the range is not even possible.
No, because, and that's correct, Deputy, that's exactly what I'm saying, because if I give
I don't accept that.
No,
again, I want to...
Can I explain why? No, just on the average, because you've asked particularly about the average. There are 2 providers.
Yes.
If I give an average and one provider knows what they pay, they can very quickly figure out what the other is being paid. That's why.
Yeah, and that's not my model. So I'm saying that there's a flaw in this model here, and the flaw in the model is not about the service delivery, whether or not these 2 organisations are providing a good service or not. That's a matter of policy, and that's a matter of judgment, and it's subjective. We're here to evaluate processes and also to evaluate the spend of money. And in process terms, I do have a concern here, because I think it is unreasonable, or at least I'll put it another way. It's reasonable for me, to at least want the range or the average I don't think a range or an average necessarily would.
We've gone through the system.
At this point in time, about 140,000, about 130,000 up to the 71 million.
Various people have
They haven't all completed. They're still in the process.
And what statistics have you of?
We've published a lot of statistics on our website, which shows the employment outcomes and job starts and so on.
But you're
question in a different way. I might be helpful to yourself.
But we do know 35 million has been paid for the service.
It's
about. And you're telling us the output of that service is visible on your website.
It is, yes. So it's 30 to 35 million.
That maybe be more helpful to yourself then, Mr. McKeown. So there's two organisations, Tourist Nua and CTEC. Yeah, is that right?
That's right.
There was 71.2 million spent between July 2015 and September 2017. Yeah. Okay. Are you in a position to give us a breakdown as to how much went to Tourist Nua and how much went to CTEC?
Again, for the same reasons. I mean, genuinely, I'm trying to protect the interest of the state in the procurement process.
But you cannot tell me then, no, hang on a second here, this is not about protecting the state or about how exactly, precisely the money was broke down. An amount of money was given to Tourist Nua. You signed the cheque. I mean, for example, take RTE, and we had a discussion on them recently. At least we know how much money was given to RTE. We might be able to.
RTE wouldn't tell us how much to give to each film producer.
I'm not asking that. I'm asking about just the figure, the overall figure that was given to Tourist Nua, the cheque that you signed for that time period. How can you not give us that?
Because it's protected by the rules of public procurement, commercial confidentiality, and, as I said, the interest of the state.
We'll have to discuss that. He's drawn the line on commercial sensitivity. There's a figure paid. Bluntly, what he's saying, if there's two organisations out there and he publishes his information, the one that's getting less than the other will be in tomorrow morning saying, I want more because you're paying more, and that'll cost the state money. We have to understand that too.
No, I do understand that, but what I'm saying is that here we are today, sitting here in the Public Accounts Committee with the accounting officer in, and we have two organisations which get very significant money from the state, and we're not even in a position to know how much of taxpayers' money is given to those two organisations. That's unbelievable.
But you know, for the overall programme.
I'm not interested in the overall programme. I'm interested in, I'm a public representative, okay? I get paid. I get paid a salary. People know what I get. We know how much exactly is given to each organisation. So I only gave the RT example because we know it was 170 million, I think was the figure, is given to them. So we don't have to go into the precise details of how that money is spent. We at least know the gross figure that's given. If you can't even give us the gross figure that's given to an organisation, that's basic accountability. That's the very simplest form, a form of accountability. And we're not even in a position to know how much this organisation gets. I think that's, I would actually want advice on that because I don't accept that would be commercially
sensitive. We're going to park this topic.
Can I say, if it's any comfort, I'd be quite prepared to give the information to the Controller and Auditor General, and if the Controller and Auditor General wants to do a review, and that will be all perfectly fine.
But
and maybe
in terms of the public arena, you say you have numbers for the scheme published.
That's right.
The cost of the scheme is published. Send us what you have, and anybody, even the two companies, should be able to work out.
It'd be a little bit more difficult, but they might get there. But it'll be the important piece of information they don't have.
There is more information you can give us without it being company specific.
We can, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'll park and I'll leave it. Other people want to come in.
Yeah, because they're well over the time.
Chair, I will send the breakdown to the Controller and Auditor General.
And can I say, by the way, my frustration isn't with you personally. Obviously, it's with the process and with the fact that I have a job to do, and if I can't get basic information, that's the source of frustration.